Okay, welcome back to the Investigative Journal on this September 29th, 2015 day on our calendar. I'm your host, Greg Anthony, and you're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. This is the Investigative Journal, the long-running alternative to the alternative media radio show. That's what a lot of my listeners gave me that title, because I go a little bit beyond what even the alternative media will want to tell you. And today, by the way, you can listen to my show every evening from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. It's also on various AM stations and several shortwave stations for selected shows. Yesterday, I gave you some comments on the Pope's visit and went back into history reading what General Harris wrote back around the time of Lincoln, when the Vatican was caught red-handed in killing Abraham Lincoln. I still to this day wonder why we are in bed with this organization. They haven't changed. However, what's happened is this has been a long-running plan that was instituted long ago, and there's certain times you can start piecing everything together. Let's look at it this way before I get into what I want to do today. What I saw yesterday was 1 million people coming out to a Catholic Mass in Philadelphia. Now, how ridiculous is that when you really think about that? Now, first of all, growing up as a Catholic Mass is nothing more than a pagan symbolic worship of the sun goddesses. Yes. And basically they're using Christianity as a front. So it's a satanic worshiping service. We had 1 million people in Philadelphia at a satanic mass. That's exactly what was going on. And the Pope was sitting there with his little mitre hat on, and all of these symbols are right in front of you, but you have no idea what they mean. Secondly, it was in Philadelphia, a place where supposed freedom and Christianity reign. Nothing could be farther than the truth. We had many, many Christians, Jews, Muslims, you name it, Buddhists, sitting there worshiping with this guy, and all it really is giving your allegiance to the beast. And what should have really happened was this man should have never been allowed to enter this country, and unfortunately, throughout the course of history, their power has grown since the beginning of our country because they had an influence in the beginning of our country, a strong influence that historians purposely leave out in the revisionist history books that you get in college. The alternative media, most of it turns a blind eye and blames the Jews for everything because they're covering for the Vatican. Then you have those out there who are basically talking anti-Vatican people, and they fail to understand this principle as well. And the point I'm trying to make is, let's see if we can make some sense out of all of this, and let you be the decider of really how this country was formed, what it's all about, what the real meaning of the Pope's visit was, and where we're at today in history as far as this hidden agenda. Now, let me read something to you before I get started. And this was, you have to understand, sometimes you have to read into the occult, read into Masonic teachings to really understand what's going on. And one of their famed writers was Manly P. Hall. And in his Gnostic extravaganza, Secret Teachings of All Ages, and it goes on with a long, long title, which I won't read, he remarked in 1988 that not only were many founders of the United States government Masons, but they received aid from a secret and august body existing in Europe, which helped them establish this country for a peculiar and particular purpose known only to the initiated few. Well, I think the august body happened to be the Jesuit order in the Vatican, along with their minions in Europe at the time. And we had founding fathers who were working with them. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that this country was established for this purpose, this peculiar purpose that only the initiated few know. Now, there's initiated few out there that are in power in our country that understand what this is. And I think you're getting the gist. Let's just say it generally. The purpose was to create a one world order, a one world government, to also allow freedom of religion for the Antichrist church to come into America under the guise of freedom of religion, since they'd been kicked out of most every country in Europe, or not allowed to practice their faith, they say, not because of their views in religion. That's what the history books will tell you. But because they were trying to overthrow governments. Now, how they do this is there's always a black and white in their organization. And what I'm saying is somebody's got to take the heat. So they created the Jesuit order. Now, I have always said this. The Jesuit order and the Vatican have to exist together. One can't exist without the other. And you're seeing that melding of that today with the Pope being a Jesuit, etc., etc. But back in history, you'll see the Jesuits did the dirty work for the Vatican. And the Vatican at times had to play the good cop and denounce the Jesuits, even though they realized they couldn't get along without them. Because the Jesuits were the ones who initiated, or were basically the henchmen in the Protestant Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. And their main goal was to do anything to acquire land, power, money for the Antichrist papacy, which they are part of. They're basically the militia, and they still do the same thing today. They're doing it here in America. But how they had to do it here was a clandestine way, was to get their foot in the door under the guise of freedom of religion, and get their foot in the door because of their guise of the United States free Constitution. This experiment, founded seemingly on the principles of freedom and justice. But behind the scenes, our leaders, even prior to 1776, had a plan involved. And that's what we try to uncover on this show. Now, there are people that I've found over the years that understood this. One is Tony Alamo, the minister that's in jail for 175 years. And we're going to look at some of what, I'm going to go back to an old interview I did with him in 2008 and play some of that later and tomorrow. Oh, there was Tupper Saucy, who wrote a book called Rulers of Evil. He understood some of the real things that have been left out of the history books, have been left out of certain books that on the market today, certain people out there who claim to be the pinnacle of anti-Jesuitism. And, let's see, who else? We have Dr. Alberto Rivera, the former Jesuit priest, who really explained what his assignments were to infiltrate churches, things like that. So we have a few people, and there's of course a few more who understand. And I know there's a lot of listeners out there who don't have a voice on the air that understand this as well. And I want to kind of set the record straight as far as you don't have, I think what I'm about to say and what I've said before needs to be on the table and discussed. But how can you do that when the people that are even fighting against the Jesuits denounce you? For example, why was Tupper Saucy labeled a Jesuit coadjutor by some out there? Because they didn't want to deal with the fact of history that was not in the books that either were given to them or they had written, that wanted to cover up a certain area of historical importance in the formation of this country and moving along in the goals of this country and how they were going to be achieved. So, what I wanted to mention, what are these points that needed to be, that never get discussed, that are important? Well, with the Pope here, it made me think a lot. And I started to think, how could our country come from a point of freedom of religion and history, of basically oppression by Catholicism, the Inquisition, and a country supposedly formed opposing these principles, that in 2015 is laying down at the feet of the very organization that created all this havoc throughout the world and killed more people than any organization with the help of their governmental minions. The people I mentioned earlier, Alamo, Saucy, Alberto Rivera, they understood this, and we don't talk so many times now today about all these concordats that this organization has, not only with us, and I use that term loosely, with us. We have diplomatic ties. They don't come out with a full-blown concordat, but it's the same thing. There's over 200 in the world with countries, and this organization is involved. They have their tentacles throughout the world, the richest organization in the world, and they're not here for the benefit of mankind. They're here to eliminate mankind and create a world that they had set up thousands of years ago, and that's progressed today. America being in the crosshairs. And this display of total media, it was almost like they were kissing his butt. You couldn't go. It was nonstop coverage of this horrendous showing of worship towards this Antichrist. That made me start to think we are such a challenged nation as far as really what the world is really all about. We have this kind of Hollywood tinsel view of it. And so, simply, I'm going to explain to you a couple things that I've talked about in depth, giving you much more detail in the past, but I want to paraphrase certain things, and I want to start with stating this. If you're going to study American history, you have to go back. Look, I recommend going all the way back to the story of Cain and Abel, but for those of you, to make things simple, let's move into past the Counter-Reformation and the Inquisition into the 1600s in England to give us an idea of how this country was formed and for what reason, and who was the masterminds behind it. Because this American Revolution didn't occur because somebody threw some tea in the ocean and then the patriots got mad because of taxes. No, it was much deeper than that. Do you think most people back in that period of time would have loved to stay under the rule of England? Now, the point I'm trying to make is there had to be someone to instigate this war. They had to figure out how, as they do in most every war, as they did in the French Revolution, as they do, during this period of time. You've got to check. It was the period of revolutions all over Europe and America. Incredible when you look at all the revolutions that were going on in this period of time. But I want to center on the free world. That's what they were calling this, the new country. The country that was unexplored. And you bet the Vatican was interested in it. But how were they going to overcome their bad reputation, the knowledge of people over in Europe of how they decimate countries or try to overthrow countries? And so we'll start in England. Now, our history books tell us that Europe or England, the Vatican has their own little encyclopedias and books, and all of our history books tell us, and I can remember when I was in history class, the point was that England persecuted Catholicism, and for that reason, they entered into America and freedom of religion, and they looked at this country as a place of refuge from the evil monarchs in Europe. Now, when you check history out, if the Vatican would have stuck just to, let's even call it their pagan religion, no one would care. I mean, look at the Pope when he came here. Did he talked more about politics and all that garbage than he did about anything else. So what do you think this organization is? It is not. First and foremost, it's a political machine working together with governments to create this one world government. You've seen it. You've seen what's going on yesterday, what they're trying to do here. Under this guise of unity, that's their goal here. They're doing things here without using the rack, without using all of those. Man, they killed millions during the Inquisition, but they had to do it by brute force. Nowadays, they don't. They'll select wars here and there to thin the population out, get their goals accomplished, but most of their work is being done through deception. And when you look back, you have to start American history, and I'm making it easy. During that period of time in England, prior, even 100 years prior to 1776, when many people were leaving Europe because of this constant battle going on with the Vatican trying to suppress people's faiths and working together, trying to undermine kings, and never knowing if the king is on one side or the other. And finally, they were caught red-handed trying to blow up Parliament, the Jesuits. And their plot was uncovered prior to the explosion. And this is well known. But it isn't well known to anybody in this country. I don't ever remember seeing much on that subject. And when that subject is talked about, it's never really talked about in depth. So we have that period of time, and we have people coming here to this country before it was formed into a republic with the states and et cetera, very adamant. I read as much as I could find in books and in libraries regarding the first people that came here, but there's some interesting quotes by captains of ships that were saying one of the main things they were concerned about was Jesuit infiltration. They didn't want anybody that was Catholic or Jesuit to be coming into this country. They wanted them out. And in fact, in the beginning of time, when they first came over, it was strictly forbidden to have a Jesuit, to have Catholicism in this country. None of them, if there was they couldn't hold any type of leadership position, nothing. So the Jesuits understood this in the Vatican, and so even to that day, even in those early days, they were infiltrating this country in a clandestine kind of way. Now, they needed a reason. They needed a reason to come here, and the reason was they really wanted to control this country. That was it. Do you think they came here to spread the faith, to do good? Do you really think that? Now look at what they did in the past when it came to European countries. Why? Ask yourself, would they change now? They really wouldn't, would they? They couldn't change. And the reason they couldn't change is because you could see in the course of history this has never been the case. So why would they do it in the last 300 years? It's just ridiculous. It's just their modus operandi had to change. And I am going to explain the two or three most important points that you have to discuss or research so that you can understand what you're living under. And realize that the only thing you can do really is understand it. You can understand it, you can help others understand it. But to come out, to try and think, or to be led by people who want you to revolt, who want you to get into a conflict is wrong. And any time you see people out there spreading this information that I do that want to lead you into that, or start leading into racist thoughts, start leading into anything but the understanding and the goodwill that you want to spread by this story, you got to watch out. And there are people out there doing it in the guise of saying, oh, we're against the Vatican and the Jesuits. I happened to run across, of course, the Tony Lamo ministry, who's completely opposite from that. The people are completely opposite, and I can tell because I've talked to many, many of them, including their pastor, and they never had anything more on their mind than spreading the word of Christ and teaching people about the Antichrist, the Vatican, in both a spiritual and secular way. That was it. It was never this rush to protest. There was never this division. There was, of course, biblical teachings that everyone's going, no one believes point blank and everything in the same way. But the message was understanding. The message was peace. And you're going to hear a much different message from other people out there. You just watch. You just listen. You're going to listen. There's not that many people out there preaching against the Vatican. You know who they are. You got to ask yourself the question, why don't they want to deal with the subjects that I'm talking about today? Why do they want to get you into a revolt, into a protest? And you'll know who they are. And all you got to do is use common sense to figure it out. Because I told you a long time ago, I don't care what side people are on when I'm dealing with agent provocateurs in the media. I really don't care. Because the real important thing is the information and who understands it, and you get it all. You want to listen to what one person says about the American Revolution and the greatness of the Founding Fathers and this infiltration that occurred later, or you want to talk about the real the story that differs from that shows their complicity in creating, like Manly Hall said, a country for a peculiar agenda, only known by the initiated few. Now, you got to put both of those together. I'm not opposed to listening to people talk differently. But why are those people opposed to it? Are they covering up something? Are they one of the initiated few that are set into this media in the alternative to keep certain things from you? The few important things that you need to put the final... when you get a puzzle, you can't complete the puzzle until the last piece is there. Back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com worldwide. Freedom is never free. We need your support today at FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased. It has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.
Okay, we're back on the Investigative Journal. We're talking, some thoughts about the Pope's visit and certain things we really need to understand about why our country was formed, the reasons behind it, how the Vatican has gained so much power over the years. And it all starts with the Jesuit order, I believe. And if you don't believe me, that's okay. But we have to look at one thing. Now, if you understand the history of the Jesuits in the Vatican, which most people don't in this country, you're going to read that they've been kicked out of more than 70 to 80 countries. And from their point of view, they're always kicked out because of their faith. From other points of view, they're kicked out because they want to overthrow either dictators or control dictators, overthrow countries so they can have power in that country and wealth and certain things like that. Now, when we were getting started in this country, the interesting thing that was going on is most of us have this idea that it was purely our patriots were fed up with England. It was not the case. France was involved in this. England was involved in this. And someone had to come up with a strategy to pit France against England and then to somehow get us involved and England involved in this war to create this new country. And so you have to read about this, but I believe the architect of that was a Jesuit general at the time named Lorenzo Ricci. Now, if you read even alternative history on this, you'll find, and in most history books, you'll see that the Jesuits at the time were disbanded just prior to the American Revolution, and the Vatican came out and basically stated that the Jesuits had overstepped their bounds, and we're eliminating this organization. They put Lorenzo Ricci, the Jesuit general at that time, a very, very intelligent man, in jail. And the story goes that he died there. And then miraculously in 1822 in that area, the Jesuits were resurrected. Now, that's what you're going to get from even most people that are talking against the Vatican. Media people talking against them. But is there another side to this story? And the other side could be very well, it's very strange to me that they were resurrected, just, 50 years later, after some of this dirty work in America was done. But could it be that they never really were disbanded behind the scenes? Publicly they were. And why were they publicly disbanded? Because one of the biggest fears in this country was the Jesuit order. So understanding the Sun Tzu's Art of War, which some say was even written by the Jesuit order, first translations in English supposedly were by them. But the idea of having a weak enemy, if you allow your enemy to think you're weak, and even to think that you no longer exist, what happens? You begin to forget about them. You basically, at this particular juncture, are, not even looking, or being you're kind of, in a sense, lulled into thinking that you're victorious. And if you understand that principle, you can get more done as a weak enemy, even one that's disbanded, so to speak, under the table, undercover, than you could ever if you never did that. So I believe the Vatican, which my principle always is the Vatican and the Jesuits have to work together. I believe that they concocted this plan so that they could create this revolution in America using the French, and there's all these technical things you got to read about how they did this, and pitting the Brits against the French and the American patriots, and instigating the Boston Tea Party, and then making things seem as if England was the culprit. And there was a big fight over land between France and England, and et cetera, et cetera. Who was pushing these stones, rolling these stones down the hill? Now, my contention is Lorenzo Ricci never died and came to the States working, and basically worked with Franklin and a number of these people, Franklin being a Masonic member, a number of these elites, to create this revolution, then create a country built on freedom, the Declaration of Independence, and built on freedom of religion. Now, the first one could never be accomplished without the Carroll family. This idea that the Vatican can get... Ricci needed somebody. Now, we're assuming he's alive, and I believe he was. It's not uncommon. They still fake deaths of people. It's not uncommon. This principle has been used even prior to this many, many times by this deceptive body. Now, if Ricci's alive, and he's one of the few people that could actually put this together behind the scenes, he needed the Carroll family, which was a very, very wealthy Catholic family, owning the land that, in fact, they decided to build Washington, D.C. on that farm. And at one point, the Tiber River, if you look at old land records in the 1600s, the Potomac was called the Tiber, and that area was called Rome. So they had to do it. There were no archdioceses back then, but at the same time, we have John Carroll, one of the brothers, studying to be a Jesuit priest, and he eventually becomes the first archbishop, the only archbishop of the Catholic Church here. Carroll family instrumental. Charles Carroll's name's on the Declaration of Independence, but they conveniently hide some of these founding fathers, and I think they conveniently hid Lorenzo Ricci, who should be considered the architect of the American Revolution. Now, seeing they could use this idea of a free country this giving, this experiment in freedom to their advantage, how could they use freedom of religion to their advantage? Well, if you have a constitution of freedom of religion that says freedom, everyone can be here, including the Vatican. And that was their foot in the door. Always a guise. Remember what Manly P. Hall said. There was a reason behind this, a peculiar agenda known to the initiated few. And fast forward now to 2015, you see that agenda playing out. It's always been to make this a Catholic country. Most of our leaders are in the pocket of the Vatican. You saw it. Most people are buffaloed by the Antichrist. You see more archdioceses in this country than, and it's amazing how many people, how the Jesuit order is even set up in this country. Georgetown University, Carroll family, that was John Carroll. Starting of that university is the major university right next to Washington, D.C. that creates all of our diplomats come from there. Even a Jesuit lawyer named Van Dam wrote the Patriot Act prior to 9/11. You don't think they know what's going on? Yes, this has been a plan. And so this overview that I've given you is just the overview. There's so many details that are interesting, and that's up to you to go research. So look into those two theories. One, the Jesuits actually were disbanded by the Vatican, and Ricci was killed. Ricci died in prison, and then they were miraculously resurrected in the 1822 after all of this got done here in America. Or was the Jesuit order disbanded for a peculiar reason? Did they get disbanded only in public so they could work undercover to get more done here? I believe that's the case. And the facts are incredible when you start looking at it. Even eyewitness accounts of people, a man like Lorenzo Ricci, in America at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and even prior to that, counseling Franklin and others on how this was to be accomplished. And those accounts are really taken out. I've only found 2 or 3 books that even remember this, and then some of the anti-Jesuit people out there in the media won't even talk about it, and the people that write about it are considered Jesuit coadjutors. Strange. All I've ever wanted is the subject to be brought up so that we could get a clear picture of why we're in the position we are today. Why this unity under ecumenism is a false unity. Why have our rights been eroded? We see it every time. I mean, you can't read a story that doesn't talk about we've lost our Fourth Amendment rights, our First Amendment rights. Why has the Vatican grown like a cancer in this country to those who understand this story? And why don't the leaders of any big faith like the Jewish faith talk against it? And then when you start looking at what's going on in Israel and the Knesset being in the pocket of the Vatican and the Vatican buying the temple, getting the ownership of the Temple Mount in the 90s, you start seeing how this beast is working. And there's so many more examples of this. But I thought it important when the Pope, on the heels of the Pope leaving, to really give you the opportunity to research this point regarding the formation of our country, regarding what was going on in England prior to it, regarding to the public account of the Jesuits being disbanded because of their menacing and infiltrating the church and actually causing the Vatican to lose a lot of money. But I've always said the Vatican and the Jesuits, since their formation, have to exist together. One can't exist anymore without the other. One protects the other works. And, maybe that's why one is called the White Pope, one is the Black Pope. So think about those things. And I'd love to find out, the more people that start researching, the more we can find. I mean, a lot of this stuff is hidden. I remember when I was in Italy I was in Rome, and I tried to understand. There was a book that came out that talked. It was the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, written, and it made a big splash in Rome. And the Vatican came out and said, "Oh, listen, here we go with the story." The Vatican taking the side that Jesus, of course, died on the cross, etc. The traditional story, and this book came out saying that Jesus never did die on the cross, and the bloodline is carried on today through the Merovingian bloodline. That's where Dan Brown's stories come and all that stuff that's still going on today. So I started looking into this. Where did this come from? And I found out that it was a plant by the Jesuits. The actual Vatican was promoting this stuff behind the scenes. And Jacques Plantard, the guy at the time who was coming out publicly in French and Italian papers stating he carried the bloodline of Christ in an organization called the Priori di Sion, didn't even exist when I went. I had to go. You couldn't just email people back then, so I took a trip to France, where their organization supposedly had if this is a huge organization, they should have they gave a headquarters out. I could never find this guy. You'd think he'd want to talk about it. The address they gave, there was really nothing there, outside of a woman that came to the door and said, "Oh, I know nobody by that name." So then I had to do more research in the libraries and found out that this probably, and then talking to some priests that gave me a little bit of insights, that the Vatican, although publicly they come out against this stuff, they create it to create the controversy. And there's the Hegelian dialectic even working in this story, so that they could get the benefit of it. And what is the benefit? The Vatican today wants to, they created the New Age agenda. Check it out through Father Pierre Desjardins, the mentor of Hillary and Bill Clinton. Read his books. That's where the New Age movement came, because the Vatican knew, if we don't get you one way, we'll get you another. And the real targets of this, to really show you how far we've gone into this cesspool of using freedom of religion as a guise. I've presented the persecution of a ministry that today shows you, the Lamo ministry shows you how this actually plays out today, because back when Pope John Paul II said, most of these organizations in America now are following the ecumenical movement. What we have to be concerned about are these fringe churches. And either they will follow us or we will figure out a way that they won't exist. That was really the message he gave. And so they use the FBI, they use our government to bring these people down. And when you see what they did to this church, this ministry, and the minister and the people, and taking the kids into putting him in jail for hundreds of years, then on bogus charges, then kidnapping children, stealing, their property through civil court cases. It's incredible. That's exactly what freedom of religion is in this country. Freedom of religion is now. If you don't follow the papal way, you have no freedom. And that's what their goal was in the beginning, that these initiates knew. That was one of the goals, and they had to do it through these means. And I believe that there were many, I can't tell you all, I can't say categorically every founding father knew this, but I think the core group, including Washington, including Franklin, understood it well, worked for them, and were playing both sides of the fence. That's why Washington, D.C. is our capital, built on Catholic John Carroll family land. Now, that's why you'll see Washington steeped in pagan symbols and symbols up on our Capitol building that have nothing to do with freedom. Why even the Statue of Liberty has nothing to do with freedom, if you understand what that statue is about, the significance behind it. And many, many other signs and symbols Washington built with satanic symbols. Just amazing how many are there and why it was done that way. And Washington was a big part of that. So how could he have not known? There's people out there that say he didn't. But I think those that are truly wanting to get to the truth will not dismiss what I just said. Those in the media covering it up will. And they will not only do that, they'll try to marginalize those trying to get this story out. That's their goal. And that's what's the difference between the alternative media and the alternative to the alternative, which is this show. And I'm sure there's much more to learn over the years. I'm sure there's much more to these stories that is not known. But there's only one way to figure it out, and that's to put it all on the table. Every story, from the mainstream view of the formation of this country to the alternative view, which leaves out this important idea that the Jesuits were not disbanded, and then this alternative to the alternative, which is now putting it all together, at least there's probably even more somewhere. But we'll never find that out unless we at least look at all these things and make up your mind on it. And entertain the idea, not to just forget about it and listen and follow what others say. Now, I got about 5 minutes left. I wanted to get to a lot of other things. But tomorrow I want to, I'll do a couple interesting things in tomorrow's show regarding some old interviews I did with Pastor Tony Alamo and others. To show you that even back in 2006, 2008, we were on this path to get to the truth and tell people really what was going on. At least Alamo was, and he's paid the ultimate price for it. Because, as John Paul II said, he was one of these fringe groups that wasn't playing the ecumenical game. And you've seen what happened to this ministry through many shows that I've done on my radio show. Now, there's a real interesting part of history that needs to be talked about, and that is this period of time prior to 1776, prior to the American Revolution, and this formation of this idea, how can we create this country with the idea of freedom of religion, and all of the little things that went involved from Europe, from the Vatican, from our people here, from, all of this. Who was the mastermind behind it? It was really a masterful way of doing this revolution, the way they pitted the French and the English together and then separated the patriot. It was an amazing organization that has been kept from the books, kept from the history books. And the history books make it out really easy, England, the bad guy, the patriots, the good guys, and we won. But it ain't that easy. And when you see how this thing plays out, when you start piecing it together, all of the little stones that had to be rolled down that hill, it's amazing. Amazing strategy used, I believe, coming from Rome. And I believe that Rome, they think they own this country. Because they put it together. It was their creation, their deceptive creation. And that's why you're seeing in 2015 the progression of this deceptive creation and how it's playing out. And no better example than what went on the last 5-6 days in this country. And watching all these leaders cow down to this papal power. I mean, those who've researched it understand it, but to see it play out is another story like this. It's very, very interesting that there was nothing on the mainstream that would ever talk about these things. And even the alternative media was lax in really understanding this in a way that makes sense, that doesn't lead to any kind of anger or revolt, but to pure understanding. because that is the only thing that will save you when it gets down to it. Because I'm talking about how can you live if you don't understand this. You're constantly going to be agitated, is what they want. Agitation, upsetment, constantly living on the edge. You don't know, why are my rights being taken away? How could this country follow this? People are saying, but there's an answer which calms the soul, calms the mind, so that you can actually know what's happening to you instead of being led on a string like a little puppet, thinking one way one day and one day the next. This story is vital to understand. And the only way you can do it is by getting all the information and then piecing through it till that little bell rings and says, wow, it could be. It could be. Well, it could be. We'll be back tomorrow on the Investigative Journal, if the creek, God willing, and the creek don't rise. See you tomorrow.